July, 1099. The walls of Valencia. The air, thick and heavy with the salt of the Mediterranean and the cloying sweetness of death, does not move. Below, a sea of torches flickers, a nervous constellation belonging to the Almoravid army, the warriors of the Black Land, who have come to reclaim this city for the true faith. They murmur and wait, smelling the weakness from the city like jackals scenting a wounded lion. Inside, there is no sound of panic, no clangor of alarm bells, only a suffocating, unnatural quiet. Within the citadel, in a room draped in black, the silence is absolute. The scent of myrrh and aloes fights a losing battle against the encroaching odor of mortality. There, laid out on a table, is the source of this silence, the dying heart of Valencia's defiance. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, el Cid Campeador, is dead. His wife, Jimena, a woman whose grief is a cold, hard diamond of resolve, moves with practiced deliberation. This is not a widow's vigil. It is the preparation for a final, impossible battle. She directs the embalmers, their work illuminated by a single candle, as they pack his body with spices, bind his limbs, and work to preserve the illusion of life. The air is filled with the whisper of linen bandages, the quiet scrape of tools, and the almost imperceptible finality of a great life extinguished. His armor, battered and dented from 100 battles, is brought forth, each piece polished to a menacing gleam. They hoist the dead weight of the hero, a chillingly compliant puppet, and begin the grotesque process of arming a corpse. The greaves are strapped, the chainmail is pulled over the unbreathing torso, the helmet is placed upon the head, its visor hiding the vacant stare of death. Finally, they carry him to the courtyard, where his legendary warhorse, Babieca, snorts and stamps, sensing the wrongness of it all. With ropes and straps, they secure him in the saddle, propping his body upright, placing his great sword, Tizona, into his rigid hand, and fixing his shield to his arm. In the pre-dawn gloom, he looks not like a dead man, but a knight lost in grim contemplation, a terrifying, silent icon of war. This is the narrative of the man who would conquer even after death. This was the saga of Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, a man whose life was the central paradox of his age, a crucible in which the conflicting identities of 11th century Iberia were melted down and forged into something new and terrifyingly powerful. To understand this man, to grasp how a loyal vassal could become a king's most hated enemy, how a devout Christian could become the trusted general of Muslim emirs, and how an exile, stripped of everything, could conquer one of Spain's richest kingdoms for himself, we must ask the core question that his story poses. How did a single warrior, driven by a personal code of honor and ambition, unite the supposed irreconcilable forces of the cross and the crescent under his own personal banner? The answer is not a simple tale of heroism or villainy, of crusade or treason. It is a story about the nature of power itself in a world where old certainties were crumbling into dust. The legend of El Cid is not merely the story of a man. It is the story of an entire world caught in the throes of violent transformation. A world where the lines on the map and the lines of faith were drawn in sand, constantly shifting with the winds of war. His final ghostly charge from the gates of Valencia was not the beginning of his legend, but its perfect, chilling culmination. It was the ultimate expression of a life spent turning weakness into strength, defeat into opportunity, and his own name into a weapon more powerful than any sword. To comprehend the specter on the horse, we must first return to the violent, chaotic, and treacherous world that created him. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the mid-11th century, a geopolitical chessboard teetering on the brink of chaos. Far to the north, the Norman descendants of Vikings were putting their final stamp on Europe, with William the Conqueror's invasion of England in 1066 fundamentally reshaping the Anglo-Saxon world. To the east, the Great Schism of 1054 had ripped Christendom in two, a theological wound between Rome and Constantinople that would never truly heal, creating a fractured Christian response to the rising power of Islam. And rising in the distant steppes was the might of the Seljuk Turks, a new and aggressive force that would soon shatter the Byzantine armies at Manzikert and begin the process that would eventually lead to the Crusades in the Holy Land. But in Iberia, this grand global drama was refracted through a local lens of bewildering complexity. The once mighty Caliphate of Córdoba had long since shattered, imploding into a collection of dozens of petty kingdoms known as taifas. These city-states, ruled by emirs, were centers of immense wealth, culture, and scientific advancement, yet they were politically and militarily fragile, consumed by decadent infighting. To their north lay the nascent Christian kingdoms of Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarre, poor, rough-hewn, and warlike, but hungry and ambitious. The great Reconquista was not yet the unified ideological crusade it would later become. Instead, it was a messy, deeply cynical affair, a perpetual low-grade war of opportunism. Christian kings allied with Muslim emirs against their own Christian rivals. Muslim factions hired Christian mercenaries to fight their co-religionists. It was a world of convivencia, a fragile coexistence punctuated by brutal violence, where faith was often secondary to political expediency and the flow of gold in the form of pariahs or tribute, paid by the wealthy taifas to their stronger Christian neighbors to be left alone. This was not a clash of civilizations in the modern sense. It was a frontier, a violent, dynamic, and morally ambiguous space where a warrior's reputation, his strength of arms, and his cunning were the only true currencies. It was into this crucible of shifting allegiances and constant brutal warfare that Rodrigo Díaz was born. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar was a product of this harsh frontier, a wolf cub born into a world of wolves. He was an infanzón, a member of the lower nobility, his bloodline respectable but lacking the vast lands and political power of the great magnates. His birthplace, Vivar, was a small village near Burgos, the heartland of Castile, a region that lived and breathed war. The very landscape forged his character. Arid plains, rocky hills, and a sky that stretched to an unforgiving horizon. This was a land where survival depended on the strength of your sword arm and the speed of your horse. His father, Diego Laínez, was a warrior of some renown, a man who had fought in the endless skirmishes against the Moors of Navarre, and from him, Rodrigo inherited a legacy not of wealth, but of martial competence. But his true education began when he was sent to be raised at the court of Prince Sancho, the eldest son of King Ferdinand the Great. This was a common practice, a way to forge bonds of loyalty between the crown and its future vassals. At Sancho's side, Rodrigo learned more than just the art of war. He learned the lethal grammar of court politics. He saw firsthand the simmering jealousies between Sancho and his younger brothers, Alfonso of Leon and Garcia of Galicia. He learned to read the subtle shifts in power, to distinguish a courtier's flattering smile from the glint of a hidden dagger. More importantly, he was exposed to the complex reality of Hispano-Arabic relations. He would have seen Muslim envoys in the court, negotiated with Moorish lords on the border, and perhaps even learned their language. For him, The Moors were not a monolithic, demonic enemy preached about in distant churches. They were a tangible part of his world. Sometimes enemies, sometimes allies, always rivals. This pragmatic, unideological upbringing was the bedrock of his future career. It forged a mind that saw the world in shades of gray, a mind that valued strength and loyalty above abstract notions of faith, creating a man who was both a devout Christian and a supreme realist, a warrior perfectly adapted to thrive in the beautiful, violent chaos of 11th century Spain. The first thunderous strike of Rodrigo's arrival on the great stage of Iberian power was not as a strategist or a politician, but as a pure, elemental force of combat. King Ferdinand the Great died in 1065, and in his will, he made the catastrophic decision to divide his kingdom among his 3 sons, planting the seeds of a bloody civil war. Sancho, the eldest, received Castile. Alfonso, the favorite, received Leon, and the youngest, Garcia, was given Galicia. Sancho, feeling cheated of his birthright, immediately set out to reunite the kingdom by force, and at his right hand, as his alferez or standard-bearer, was the young Rodrigo Díaz. The role of alferez was far more than ceremonial. He was the commander of the royal army, the king's personal champion, the man who would literally carry the king's standard into the thick of the fighting. It was a position of immense trust and visibility, and Rodrigo filled it with terrifying prowess. In the brutal War of the 3 Sanchos, a conflict involving Sancho of Castile against the Sanchos of Aragon and Navarre, Rodrigo's reputation began to crystallize. It was here, in the crucible of battle after battle, that he earned the name that would first make him famous: Campeador, the champion. The name likely arose from his role in single combat, the reyeptos, or judicial duels that were often used to settle disputes over territory. In one famous instance, he fought for Castile against a Navarrese champion to decide the ownership of a series of border castles, and his victory cemented both Castile's claim and his own growing legend. He was the king's sword arm, the physical embodiment of Castilian might, a young warrior whose ferocity and tactical acumen were becoming the stuff of fireside songs. This was his first taste of real power, the power that comes from being universally recognized as the most dangerous man on the field of battle. He was Sancho's man, his fortunes inextricably linked to his king, and together they were an unstoppable force, methodically dismantling the kingdom their father had so foolishly divided. To understand the ferocious trajectory of El Cid's life, one must look beyond the battles and betrayals to the core of his being, to the inner demon that drove him relentlessly forward. This driving force was not, as later legends would claim, a simple crusading zeal. It was a profound and all-consuming obsession with the concept of honra. In the feudal world of 11th century Spain, honra was more than just honor. It was a man's entire public worth, his reputation, his status, his very identity. It was built upon a foundation of loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, and the keeping of one's word. But it was also a fragile thing, something that could be stripped away by the whim of a powerful king or the whispered poison of a jealous court rival. For Rodrigo, a man from the lower nobility whose only true capital was his martial skill, his honra was everything. It was the armor for his soul. His fanatical loyalty to his first lord, King Sancho, was the first expression of this code. He saw his service not as a job, but as a sacred pact, and his success as Sancho's champion was the process of accumulating honra. This obsession explains the almost pathological intensity of his actions. When he fought not just to win, but to dominate, to leave no doubt about his supremacy. When he gave his word, it was an unbreakable bond. This inner demon of Honra also contained a darker element, a burning ambition to elevate his status, to ensure his legacy was so great that no king could ever erase it. He saw the great magnates at court, men of immense wealth and power, and knew that his own standing, built on merit alone, was precarious. This created a deep-seated fear of disgrace, a terror of being cast down and forgotten. It was this fear, this relentless drive to build and protect his Honra, that would fuel his greatest triumphs and lead to his most defiant acts. He was not just fighting for a king or for territory. He was fighting for his very existence in the memory of mankind, a battle he would continue to wage even from beyond the grave. The defining moment of Rodrigo's early life, the event that would forever alter his destiny and set him on a collision course with his own world, was the brutal unraveling of King Ferdinand's legacy in a storm of fraternal ambition. The bond between Rodrigo and his king, Sancho II of Castile, was absolute. Together, they were a perfect synthesis of political will and military might. They first defeated their cousins in Aragon and Navarre, securing Castile's borders before turning on their own family. In a series of swift campaigns, they drove their youngest brother, Garcia, from his kingdom of Galicia, and then, in the Great Battle of Golpejera in 1072, they decisively defeated their other brother, Alfonso of Leon. Alfonso was captured, and Sancho was crowned king of a reunited realm, the undisputed master of Christian Iberia. Rodrigo, the Campeador, stood at the zenith of his power as a vassal, the right hand of a triumphant king he deeply respected and loved. But one final piece of the kingdom held out, the city of Zamora, ruled by their sister, Uraxa, who had given sanctuary to Leonese nobles loyal to the defeated Alfonso. It was during the siege of this city that fate, or perhaps human treachery, intervened. In the autumn of 1072, King Sancho, while inspecting his siege lines, was assassinated by a nobleman who had pretended to be a deserter from the city. The chaos was immediate. The Castilian army, leaderless and heartbroken, fell apart. And from the ashes of this catastrophe, a new king emerged. Alfonso, the recently defeated and exiled brother, who was conveniently allowed to escape his captivity and return to claim the thrones of both Leon and Castile. For Rodrigo, this was more than a political disaster. It was a profound personal trauma. His lord, his patron, his comrade in arms, had been murdered, and the beneficiary of that murder was the very man they had just defeated. An unbreakable shadow of suspicion now fell upon Alfonso, and Rodrigo, whose entire worldview was built on the sacredness of loyalty, found himself the most powerful subject of a king he had every reason to believe was a fratricide. The stage was set for an epic confrontation. The tension between the new king and his dead brother's champion was a poison that seeped into the very foundations of the newly reunited kingdom. While the other Castilian nobles, ever pragmatic, rushed to swear fealty to Alfonso VI, Rodrigo held back. He was the Campeador, the soul of the Castilian army, and his allegiance was the key to stabilizing the fractured realm. Alfonso needed him, and Rodrigo knew it. This knowledge gave him the leverage for one of the most audacious acts of defiance in medieval history, the Oath of Santa Gadea. According to the epic poems that would later immortalize the event, Rodrigo, in the church of Santa Gadea in Burgos, in front of the assembled court, refused to kiss the king's hand and swear loyalty until Alfonso and a dozen of his own vassals had sworn a public oath on the Holy Scriptures that they had no part, directly or indirectly, in the murder of King Sancho. The sensory details of the scene are electric. The cold stone of the church, the smell of incense and fear, the dead silence of the magnates as this lone warrior confronts his new sovereign. Alfonso, his face a mask of controlled fury, is forced to submit to the humiliation. He places his hand on the Bible and swears the oath, but as the legend tells it, after the ordeal was over, the king's rage was palpable. "You swear me an oath where you suspect I am guilty," he is said to have muttered, his hatred for Rodrigo now set in stone. This single act was the pivot upon which Rodrigo's life turned. He had upheld his honra, satisfying his duty to his murdered lord and demonstrating his power to the entire kingdom. But in doing so, he had purchased a moment of moral victory at the price of the king's eternal enmity. He had drawn a line in the sand, and from that day forward, he was a marked man at court, a constant living reminder of the dark cloud that hung over Alfonso's ascension. The king would use him, but never trust him, and would wait patiently for the first opportunity to destroy the man who had dared to publicly shame him. The primary antagonist in the saga of El Cid was not a single man, but a dual force, a pincer movement of threats that defined his world. The first, and most intimate, was the suffocating, paranoid animosity of his own sovereign, King Alfonso VI. Alfonso was no simple villain. He was a canny and effective ruler, a pious man who would later style himself Emperor of all Spain. But he was also a king who lived under the shadow of his brother's murder, and he saw in Rodrigo not a loyal vassal, but a walking accusation. Rodrigo's military genius, his popularity with the soldiers, his unbending sense of personal honor, all the qualities that made him a peerless asset, were, in the king's eyes, a profound threat. A subject so powerful, so famous, could one day challenge the crown itself. This personal drama, a cold war of simmering resentment and calculated mistrust played out in the halls of power, was the engine of Rodrigo's first exile. But while this internal conflict festered, a far greater threat was gathering on the horizon, a macro-level antagonist that would shatter the Iberian chessboard entirely. From the deserts of North Africa, a new power had arisen, the Almoravids. They were a dynasty of fanatical Berber nomads, puritanical and warlike, who viewed the decadent, cultured Taifa kingdoms of Al-Andalus with contempt. They saw the pariahs the Taifa emirs paid to Christian kings as a form of blasphemous appeasement. When the Taifa of Seville, facing overwhelming pressure from Alfonso, made a desperate plea for aid to the Almoravid emir, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, they unknowingly opened a Pandora's box. In 1086, Yusuf crossed the Straits of Gibraltar with a massive, disciplined army. At the Battle of Sagrajas, they inflicted a catastrophic, annihilating defeat upon the combined Christian forces of Alfonso X. The old rules of the game were over. The era of cynical alliances and tribute payments was replaced by a brutal, existential holy war. The arrival of this external, ideological force would change everything, forcing Alfonso to swallow his pride and recall the one man he hated most, the one general who might be able to stand against the storm: Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar. The first fall from grace was as swift as it was predictable. In the years following the oath of Santa Gadea, Rodrigo continued to serve the king, but his position at court was constantly undermined by a faction of rival nobles, chief among them Count Garcia Ordóñez, a man whose jealousy of the Campeador's fame was matched only by his ambition. They were the whispers in the king's ear, constantly interpreting Rodrigo's actions in the most negative light. The breaking point came in 1081. Rodrigo had been sent on a mission to Seville to collect the annual tribute, the pariahs. While he was there, the neighboring Muslim kingdom of Granada, incited by some of Alfonso's own Christian nobles, including Garcia Ordóñez, launched an attack on Seville. Acting as a loyal agent of his king, whose tributary Seville was, Rodrigo led his troops alongside the Sevillan army to repel the invasion. In the ensuing Battle of Cabra, he not only crushed the Granadan forces, but also captured several Christian lords fighting alongside them, including his nemesis, Count Ordóñez. In a gesture of supreme insult, Rodrigo, according to the poem, plucked the Count's beard, a grave dishonor. When Rodrigo returned to court, his rivals, now with a personal vendetta to fuel their whispers, spun the story for the king. They claimed Rodrigo had acted with excessive aggression, had provoked the conflict, and most damningly, that he had stolen a portion of the tribute for himself. For King Alfonso, this was the perfect pretext, the long-awaited excuse to rid himself of his troublesome vassal. He formally pronounced a sentence of exile. For Rodrigo, this was a psychological cataclysm. He was stripped of his lands, his titles, his home. His family was placed in royal custody. The man who had lived his entire life by the code of loyalty and had done nothing but serve his king faithfully and effectively was now an outcast, a man without a lord, without a place in the world he had helped to build. It was in this moment of utter desolation that the old Rodrigo, the loyal vassal of Castile, died, and a new entity, El Cid, the master of his own destiny, began to be born. He understood then, in the bitter dust of the road to exile, that loyalty to a man was meaningless. True power lay in reputation, in wealth, and in the strength of the army that followed you. Cast out from the Christian kingdoms, a warrior of Rodrigo's stature had few options. He could have gone to Aragon or Navarre, but instead he made a decision that was both deeply pragmatic and profoundly shocking to the sensibilities of his age. He traveled east and offered his sword to the one ruler whose patronage would be the most lucrative and the most stable, Abu Ja'far al-Mu'tamin, the hooded emir of the Taifa of Zaragoza. Zaragoza was one of the northernmost and most powerful of the Taifa states, a center of learning and culture, but also one constantly under pressure from its Christian neighbors, particularly the Kingdom of Aragon and the County of Barcelona. For al-Mu'tamin, a cultured man known as the Geometer King, the chance to hire the most famous Christian general in Iberia was an incredible coup. For Rodrigo, it was a lifeline. Here, the central paradox of his life took concrete form. The champion of Castile, the devout Catholic, now commanded the armies of a Muslim potentate. He brought with him his mesnada, his loyal private warband of Castilian knights, and integrated them with the emir's own Andalusian and Berber troops. It was in Zaragoza that Rodrigo Díaz, the Campeador, was reborn as El Cid. The title, derived from the Arabic al-Sidi, meaning the Lord, was what his own Muslim soldiers began to call him, a term of profound respect that acknowledged him as their master, regardless of his faith. In the service of Zaragoza, he fought with his characteristic brilliance and ruthlessness. He defended the emir's lands against the encroachments of King Sancho Ramirez of Aragon. And in a twist of historical irony, he found himself facing off against his old Christian rivals, who were now allied with his Muslim enemies. This period in exile was his military and political graduate school. He was no longer just a field commander executing a king's strategy. He was now the grand strategist himself, responsible for the defense of an entire kingdom, managing diplomacy, logistics, and multi-ethnic armies. He was learning the art of statecraft from the inside, proving that his skills were transferable, that his genius for war and leadership transcended the boundaries of faith and culture. He was becoming an independent power. The definitive proof of El Cid's transformation from a disgraced exile into a sovereign force came in the year 1084 at the Battle of Almanar. The emir of Zaragoza, Al-Mutamin, was locked in a bitter struggle with his own brother, the ruler of the neighboring Taifa of Lerida, who had made a fateful alliance with both the King of Aragon and the powerful Count of Barcelona, Berenguer Ramon II, known as the Fratricide. An enormous Christian-Muslim coalition army marched on Zaragoza's territory, their intention to crush al-Mutamin and place his brother on the throne. To face this overwhelming force, the emir sent his supreme commander, El Cid. The sensory details of the ensuing clash, as passed down through chronicles and poems, are vivid. El Cid, at the head of a much smaller, primarily Muslim army, used his superior knowledge of the terrain and his mastery of tactical maneuver. He likely employed the classic Moorish tactic of the torna fue, a feigned retreat designed to lure an overconfident enemy into a disorganized pursuit, only to turn and ambush them. The sound would have been a terrifying cacophony, the thunder of cavalry charges, the high-pitched war cries of the Andalusian soldiers, the guttural shouts of the Castilian knights, and the clash of steel on steel. The Christian Catalan forces, so confident in their numerical superiority, broke and fled in a state of utter panic. The victory was total and absolute. The enemy army was shattered and, most incredibly, the great Count of Barcelona himself was taken prisoner. The image is staggering. The exile, the cast-off general, now holding one of the most powerful Christian princes of Iberia as his captive. He brought the Count back to Zaragoza in chains, a living trophy of his unparalleled military genius. The victory sent shockwaves across the peninsula. It announced that El Cid was no longer a mercenary to be hired, but a power to be reckoned with, a man who could create and destroy alliances, a kingmaker who could humiliate the proudest of lords. His honra was restored, not by the grace of a king, but by his own sword. This was the moment of hubris, the psychological summit from which Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar looked down upon the world and saw it anew. He was no longer a vassal begging for his king's favor. He was El Cid, the Lord, a name given to him by his adoring Moorish soldiers, a title he had earned in blood and which no king could bestow or take away. In the aftermath of Almanar, as he treated his captive, the Count of Barcelona, with a mixture of chivalric courtesy and the clear condescension of a superior, his internal transformation was complete. He saw himself now as a man unbound by the petty structures of feudal society. Kings and counts were just men, susceptible to greed, jealousy, and incompetence. He, however, was something different. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of martial victory. His loyalty was no longer to a place like Castile or to a person like a king, but to an ideal of competence and to the men, Christian and Muslim, who followed his banner. He was their provider, their protector, their guarantee of victory and plunder. This was the birth of his unique form of leadership. He had transcended the simple identity of a Castilian knight and become a warlord prince, a figure more akin to the great condottieri of the Italian Renaissance centuries later. His worldview had been irrevocably altered by his exile and his experiences in the sophisticated multicultural court of Zaragoza. He had seen that the world was not a simple binary of Christian versus Muslim. It was a complex web of personal ambitions, where power, not piety, was the ultimate arbiter. He saw himself as the supreme player in this game, a man whom fate or God had chosen for a destiny far greater than being the mere servant of a lesser man like Alfonso. This psychology of triumph was not just arrogance, it was a profound realization of his own worth and a cold, hard assessment of the world around him. From this point on, he would operate not as a subject, but as a sovereign. The sworn enemy, the shadow that loomed over El Cid's entire career, remained King Alfonso VI. Their relationship was one of the great personal dramas of the age, a toxic, codependent dance of mutual necessity and profound, irreconcilable mistrust. Alfonso was not a simple tyrant. He was a great king in his own right, a man who pushed the borders of Leon Castile further than ever before, who conquered the ancient Visigothic capital of Toledo in 1085, a monumental victory for Christendom. He was ambitious, pious, and a shrewd politician, but his greatness was marred by this one festering wound, his relationship with Rodrigo. In El Cid, Alfonso saw a distorted reflection of his own ambition, but one untethered to a crown. He saw a man whose natural authority with soldiers was greater than his own, a man whose legend grew with every victory, threatening to eclipse the king's. He needed Rodrigo's sword, especially after the Almoravid invasion began, and the Christian armies were reeling from the disaster at Sagrajas. This need forced him to swallow his pride and recall the exile, to restore his lands and titles. But he could never bring himself to trust him. Every piece of advice from El Cid was scrutinized for a hidden motive. Every victory was tinged with the fear that it would only make his vassal more powerful and popular. For his part, Rodrigo viewed Alfonso with a cold, clear-eyed pragmatism. He likely never forgave him for the death of Sancho or for the humiliation of his first exile. He craved the legitimacy that only a royal pardon could provide, the ability to see his family and reclaim his ancestral lands. He was willing to serve Alfonso, to fight his battles, but the old, unquestioning loyalty was gone forever, replaced by a guarded, contractual arrangement. It was a relationship built on sand, a partnership between two lions forced to share the same territory, each one constantly watching the other, waiting for the moment of weakness that would allow for a final, decisive strike. This personal Cold War between the king and his greatest warrior was a central, tragic fault line running through the heart of Christian Spain. El Cid's true genius was not just on the battlefield, but in the revolutionary way he organized the very instrument of his power, his private army, his mesnada. This was no ordinary feudal levy. In an age where armies were typically temporary gatherings of vassals fulfilling their duty to a lord, El Cid's mesnada was a permanent, professional, and multicultural fighting force, loyal to one man and one man only. It was, in essence, a mobile, self-sustaining military state. At its core were the veteran Castilian knights, the hidalgos and infanzones who had followed him into his first exile, men bound to him by years of shared hardship and victory. But around this core, he built something radically new. He actively recruited warriors from all corners of Iberia, regardless of their origin or faith. His army included Aragonese knights, Navarrese foot soldiers, and, most remarkably, a large contingent of Moorish warriors who saw in him a leader who guaranteed success and therefore plunder. He was not a Christian general with some Muslim auxiliaries. He was the commander of a truly integrated army. This meritocracy was funded by a systematic and ruthless economic model. El Cid became the master of the razzia, the lightning-fast raid deep into enemy territory, designed not to conquer land, but to seize portable wealth, gold, livestock, and slaves. Even more importantly, he perfected the system of pariahs, forcing weaker territories, both Muslim and Christian, to pay him massive amounts of tribute in exchange for protection often from himself. He was, in modern terms, the CEO of a highly profitable war corporation. His army was his company, his soldiers were his employees, and the spoils of war were their dividends. This created a bond of loyalty that was far stronger than any feudal oath. His men followed him not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because following El Cid meant a life of adventure, wealth, and victory. This personal army was the ultimate source of his independence, the tool that allowed him to defy kings and carve out his own destiny. While the epic poems focus on the clash of swords and the high drama of courts, the texture of El Cid's life was enriched by the onions and vegetables of his personal world, particularly the formidable women who anchored his ambition. His wife, Jimena Diaz, was no passive medieval spouse. She was a high-born noblewoman, a cousin of King Alfonso himself, and their marriage had likely been an early attempt by the king to bind Rodrigo more closely to the crown. During his long exiles, she endured house arrest, separation from her husband, and the constant uncertainty of his fortunes with a stoic resolve that matched his own. She was the guardian of his legacy, the regent of his domestic world, and the mother of his children, whose fates would become crucial chess pieces in his grand strategy. He had 2 daughters, Cristina and Maria, and a son, Diego. In a world where bloodlines were paramount, El Cid, the upstart from the lower nobility, sought to secure his dynasty through brilliant marriages for his children. He aimed high, arranging unions for his daughters with princes of the blood, linking his family to the royal houses of Navarre and Barcelona. This was his long-term plan for Honra, to see his own blood flowing in the veins of future kings. The story of these daughters would later take a dark turn, forming the basis for the Cantar de la Afrenta de Corpes, a section of the epic poem where they are abused by their noble husbands, the Infantes of Carrion, leading to a brutal vengeance exacted by El Cid. While likely fictionalized, this episode in the poem speaks to the deep cultural importance placed on family honor and the role of women as vessels of that honor. These domestic threads, the steadfast loyalty of his wife, the strategic importance of his children, reveal a different side of the warlord. They show a man deeply concerned with legacy, a patriarch fighting not just for his own glory, but for a permanent place for his family at the very pinnacle of the Iberian aristocracy. The fragile equilibrium of the peninsula, the game of shifting alliances and tribute payments that El Cid had mastered, was shattered permanently in the summer of 1086. The Almoravid emir, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, having crossed from Africa, was on the march. King Alfonso VI, despite his personal animosity toward many of the Andalusian emirs, understood that this was an existential threat to all. He gathered the largest Christian army Iberia had seen in generations, a grand coalition of knights from Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarre, and marched south to confront the invaders. The 2 armies met on the 23rd of October near the town of Sagrajas. The sensory details of the battle are a nightmare of dust and blood. The Christian forces, confident in their heavy cavalry, launched a ferocious charge that initially broke the Almoravid front line. But Yusuf was a master strategist. He held his elite guard of African warriors in reserve, and as the Christian knights became disorganized in their pursuit, he unleashed them in a devastating flanking maneuver, while his camp's drummers beat a terrifying, unearthly rhythm that unnerved the Christian horses and men. The result was not just a defeat, it was an apocalypse. The Christian army was annihilated. Alfonso himself was wounded and barely escaped with a handful of retainers. The flower of Iberian chivalry lay dead on the plains of Badajoz. The news of Sagradas spread like a shockwave. The swaggering confidence of the Christian kingdoms was broken. The Taifa emirs who had invited the Almoravids now found themselves being systematically conquered by their saviors. The old world was burning. In his court at Leon, Alfonso, humbled and desperate, faced a terrifying reality. The fundamentalist wave from Africa was poised to sweep him and his kingdom away. There was only one commander in all of Spain, one military genius who had never known defeat, who had experience fighting alongside and against Muslim armies, and who possessed the audacity to face the seemingly invincible Almoravids. The king had to swallow the bitterest of pills. He had to send a message to the man he had exiled and humiliated. He had to ask El Cid to come back. The reconciliation between the king and the warlord was, like their entire relationship, fraught with tension and doomed to fail. For a brief period, they worked together against the common enemy. El Cid waged a brilliant campaign in the east, the Levante, securing the region and preventing it from falling under Almoravid control, thus protecting Alfonso's flank. But the old mistrust remained, a cancer at the heart of their alliance. The final break came in 1092. King Alfonso was besieging an Almoravid-held city, and El Cid was marching his army to join him. However, a breakdown in communication, or, as El Cid's enemies claimed, a deliberate act of defiance, led to El Cid's forces taking a different route and failing to arrive at the rendezvous point. To Alfonso, paranoid and ever watchful for signs of betrayal, this was the ultimate fateful act. He saw it not as a mistake, but as a deliberate snub, a calculated move by his overmighty vassal to operate as an independent king. The psychology of this error is key. Alfonso, humiliated at Sagradas and now struggling to contain the Almoravid tide, could not tolerate any perceived challenge to his authority. His pride, already wounded, was now shattered. He flew into a rage, and without a formal hearing, he once again condemned Rodrigo to exile, seizing his lands and imprisoning his family. For El Cid, this second betrayal was the final lesson. He had tried to play by the king's rules again, and again he had been punished for his success. He understood now, with absolute chilling clarity, that there was no future for him as a subject of Alfonso XIII. He could never again place his fate or his family's safety in the hands of a capricious, jealous monarch. His loyalty was now only to himself and his men. If the world would not grant him a kingdom, he would have to conquer one. His eyes turned to the richest prize on the Mediterranean coast, the pearl of the Taifas, Valencia. The king's fateful error had not broken El Cid, it had unleashed him. The final exile did not lead to despair. It led to the single most audacious act of El Cid's career. The city of Valencia was a jewel, a wealthy Taifa kingdom rich from trade and agriculture, but it was also politically unstable, a prize coveted by the Almoravids, the Count of Barcelona, and the King of Aragon. El Cid saw it not as a target for a raid, but as the seat of his own future kingdom. The campaign to conquer it, beginning around 1092 and culminating in 1094, was a masterclass in brutality, strategy, and psychological warfare. This was not a chivalrous affair. It was a slow, grinding, merciless siege. El Cid systematically devastated the surrounding countryside, the Huerta, burning the verdant orchards and farmlands that were the source of the city's wealth. The air for miles around Valencia would have been thick with the acrid smoke of burning olive groves and the stench of rotting crops. He seized the city's outlying castles, cutting off all supply lines, slowly strangling his prey. Inside the city walls, the population starved. The siege lasted for nearly 20 months. Chronicles speak of citizens resorting to eating rats and leather, of a city descending into a living hell. El Cid showed no mercy. When a relief army sent by the Almoravids finally approached, he used his tactical genius to crush it in open battle, sealing Valencia's fate. In June of 1094, the city surrendered. El Cid, the exile, the landless knight, rode through the gates as its conqueror. He had turned the greatest catastrophe of his life, his final, irrevocable break with his king, into his greatest opportunity. He had not merely survived, he had triumphed on a scale previously unimaginable. He was no longer a mercenary or a vassal. He was a prince, the absolute ruler of a great Mediterranean city-state, a sovereign in his own right. The fall of Valencia heralded the collapse of the old Iberian order and the dawn of a new one, personified by El Cid himself. He was now the Lord of Valencia, a Christian prince ruling over a vast Muslim and Jewish population. This was the ultimate paradox of his life, fully realized. He established a court, minted his own currency, and dispensed justice. His rule was a model of harsh pragmatism. He initially promised to respect the lives and property of the citizens, but later, after an Almoravid sympathizer was named as the city's leader, he unleashed a wave of brutal reprisals, making an example of the city's former ruler by having him burned alive. He was no gentle sovereign. He ruled through a combination of fear and grudging respect. He established a seigneurie, a lordship that was beholden to no one. He was now a major power in the Mediterranean, a player on the same level as the kings and counts who had once been his masters. His primary task was survival, as his new kingdom was an island of Christian rule in a sea of Almoravid power. For the remaining years of his life, he would be locked in a constant, desperate struggle to defend his prize. He fought off multiple massive Almoravid attempts to retake the city, most notably at the Battle of Cuarte in 1094, where he won another stunning victory against a numerically superior foe. He had become the bulwark of Christendom in the East, a role his own king had failed to perform. He was a living legend, a figure whose exploits were already being sung by minstrels across Spain. He had achieved the ultimate honra. He had carved a kingdom out of chaos with his own sword, becoming the very thing King Alfonso had always feared, a king in all but name. The end came not on a battlefield, amidst the glorious chaos of a cavalry charge, but quietly, within the stone walls of the city he had conquered. In the spring of 1099, during one of the endless skirmishes with the Almoravids besieging his city, El Cid was wounded by a stray arrow. The wound festered, and the great warrior, the man who had seemed invincible for 3 decades, was slowly brought down by infection. He died in his bed in July, leaving his kingdom and his family surrounded by a triumphant enemy army. The sensory experience inside Valencia must have been one of profound, terrifying despair. The inhuman hum of the massive Almoravid camp outside the walls was a constant reminder of their impending doom. The leader who had been their shield, their talisman of victory, was gone. Panic began to grip the city. It was in this moment of ultimate collapse that his wife, Jimena, executed his final, brilliant strategic command, an act of psychological warfare so audacious it would cement his legend for eternity. Following his last instructions, she had his body embalmed and armed. As the Almoravid army under General Muzdali prepared for their final assault, confident that the city's spirit had died with its leader, the gates of Valencia swung open. In the eerie light of dawn, a lone figure rode out, silent and implacable. It was El Cid, fully armored, upright in the saddle of his white war-horse Babieca, his great sword Tizona in his hand, his banner fluttering beside him. Behind him rode his best knights, a silent, grim procession. To the superstitious Almoravid soldiers, who had come to believe El Cid was possessed of supernatural power, the sight was one of pure terror. They believed they were seeing his ghost, an undead knight who could not be killed. A wave of panic ripped through their ranks. The charge of the Valencian army, led by the corpse of their commander, turned the enemy's fear into a full-blown rout. The Almoravids broke and fled, slaughtered by the hundreds. El Cid had won his final battle. The legacy of Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar is a fierce battleground of conflicting interpretations, a testament to the complexity of the man and the world he inhabited. For centuries, and especially under the nationalist regime of Francisco Franco, he was presented as a one-dimensional figure, the perfect Catholic knight, the selfless patriot, the founding father of a unified Christian Spain. He was polished into a marble idol of the Reconquista, his service to Muslim emirs conveniently ignored or explained away as a temporary aberration. He became the supreme national hero, the embodiment of Spanish martial virtue. Yet, for Arab chroniclers of his time, the picture was vastly different. To his enemies, like the Almoravids, he was a ruthless tyrant, a godless barbarian who sacked and terrorized Muslim lands. But to his allies, like the emirs of Zaragoza, he was a respected and honorable commander, a man whose word could be trusted, a military genius to be admired. They called him Campeador and Sidi, titles of respect, not derision. Modern historians, stripping away the layers of myth and propaganda, see a third figure, perhaps the most accurate of all, the ultimate pragmatist. They see a quintessential frontier warlord, a man forged in the crucible of a multicultural society where survival trumped ideology. He was not a crusader in the later sense of the word. He was a feudal entrepreneur of war, a man whose primary loyalties were to his family, his men, and his own code of honra. He was a product of a specific time and place, an era before religious identity had become the rigid, all-encompassing marker it would later be. This conflict of interpretations is his true legacy. The fact that he can be credibly claimed as a Christian crusader, an honorable ally of Muslims, and a ruthless opportunist, proves that he was a man who transcended the simple categories of his age. So we return to the core question. How did this exile, this champion of a Christian king, become a legend by uniting Moors and Christians? The answer lies in solving the central paradox of his life. El Cid did not unite them under a modern banner of secular tolerance or religious pluralism. He did not preach a message of brotherhood. He united them under something far more powerful and immediate in the 11th century, the banner of his own competence. In a fractured, violent, and unpredictable world, ruled by capricious kings and feuding emirs, Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar was a constant. He was the guarantee of victory. For a Christian knight cast out of Castile, joining El Cid's mesnada meant a life of purpose, glory, and wealth, far more than he could expect from his own king. For a Moorish warrior from Zaragoza, serving under Al-Cidi meant being on the winning side, led by the greatest general of the age, a man who judged his soldiers by their skill and courage, not by the God to whom they prayed. The force that bound his army together was not a shared faith or nationality, but a shared, fierce, personal loyalty to him. He was the perfect leader for a frontier society, a place where a man's worth was measured by his deeds, not his bloodline or his creed. His genius was in creating a new, synthetic identity around himself. To follow El Cid was its own form of citizenship, its own religion. He broke the old rules of allegiance, to king, to faith, to homeland, and replaced them with a single, simple, and infinitely more compelling rule: allegiance to the man who could lead you to triumph. He conquered Valencia not as a Christian, but as El Cid. He ruled it not as a Castilian, but as El Cid. This was the profound answer his life provided. In an age of crumbling institutions, the charismatic individual becomes the new institution. Ultimately, the verdict of history on El Cid is that he represents the universal lesson of the frontier. On the edges of empires and at the crossroads of civilizations, where established orders are weak and identities are fluid, the rules are different. Here, new men and new forms of power can emerge with astonishing speed. Rodrigo's life was a testament to the power of the individual will to shape destiny in defiance of the structures of birthright and religion. He was not a king, but he lived and died like one. He was not a saint, but he became a national icon. His story is not truly about the clash of Christianity and Islam. It is about the eternal struggle between the individual and the system. He demonstrated that in times of chaos, leadership is not inherited, it is seized. The qualities that define such a leader are timeless: overwhelming competence, unwavering self-belief, strategic genius, and the rare charismatic ability to inspire absolute loyalty in a diverse group of followers. He was the man the established order produced and then cast out, only to watch in terror as he built a new order in his own image. He is an archetype that resonates throughout history, from the Roman general Sulla to the condottieri of Italy to the warlords of any collapsing state. He proves that when the center cannot hold, power flows to the periphery, to the strong man on the border who understands the new, brutal arithmetic of survival and conquest. His saga is a timeless and unsettling reminder that the forces that forge history are often not grand ideologies, but the ambitions and grievances of extraordinary individuals. The final frame, the image that encapsulates the entire saga, is that of the silent rider leaving the gates of Valencia. It is the perfect metaphor, the delicious kebab that leaves an indelible aftertaste. It is the image of a man whose reputation had become a tangible weapon, a force more powerful than flesh and blood. All his life, he had meticulously built his honra, his legend, through deeds of impossible valor and unwavering resolve. In the end, that legend took on a life of its own. The Almoravids were not defeated by a clever tactic or a surprise attack. They were defeated by a story. They fled from the ghost of El Cid, the terrifying idea of a warrior so indomitable that not even death itself could stop him. This is the essence of his immortality. The man, Rodrigo Díaz, died of a common wound, but the symbol he had created, El Cid Campeador, was truly unkillable. It detached itself from the mortal man and rode out into eternity, a silent, armored icon of indomitable will. That specter on horseback, riding through the shimmering dawn, is his final verdict on the world. That a man's life is finite, but a legend, if forged in a hot enough fire, can last forever. It can continue to win battles, inspire nations, and ride through the landscapes of our imagination, a silent testament to the knight who conquered his enemies, his king, his exile, and finally, death itself,